Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Larry Lederman, the MC for this event, the sixth session sponsored by the Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI, located in Waterloo, Ontario. First, I would like to recognize some of our guests. The recently arrived, just a month ago, Ambassador of Afghanistan, His Excellency Sham Bathija, the High Commissioner of Malaysia, Her Excellency Dato, she's at the back, she's shy, Hayat Ismail, thank you. The Ambassador of the Netherlands, Kees Kolle. The Ambassador of Switzerland, His Excellency Ulrich Lehner. And members of several embassies, Japan, Spain, Germany, France, the United States, the UAE, Chile, Israel, and if I've left anyone out, please let me know and I'll identify you. We also welcome members of Parliament and departments and agencies of the Canadian government and members of Carleton University and Ottawa University, and also former Canadian ambassadors who are arriving late, but that's all right. And so now it is my pleasure to ask Aaron Scholl to please come to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you very much, Larry, and it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here to welcome Melissa Hathaway to the podium. My name is Aaron Scholl. I'm legal counsel to the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo. I'm delighted to welcome Melissa for two reasons. The first is that she's recently joined CIGI as a distinguished fellow, and I've had the opportunity to work with her on various matters, and I can indicate without reservation that she's deeply impressive, both in terms of her substance and her ability to convey complex material succinctly. It's truly an honor to be able to welcome her for that reason. The second reason is the breadth of experience that Melissa brings. She was a senior advisor to two presidents. She runs her own consulting firm. She ran the cyberspace policy review for the United States government. I mean, her background is absolutely exceptional in this ongoing and riveting area of policy making and policy concern. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Melissa Hathaway.
Thank you. Good evening. It's truly my pleasure to be here this evening, support CIGI and the Global Policy Forum, Larry for the welcome here to the Rideau Club, and for actually the honor of all of you showing up and taking your time to listen to me tonight. I hope that I earn my glass of wine at the end of this, and that you enjoy what I have to say or are not too scared when you leave the room. And so I plan on speaking for about 40 minutes, and I know it's advertised for maybe 30. It depends on how fast I end up speaking. And the title of my presentation is Cybersecurity, Are You Winning or Are You Losing? And I'd like to give you kind of a tour de table of how to think about cybersecurity, and I'm going to start with just a brief introduction. I want to talk about first is the internet. The internet began on October 29th, 1969, with a transmission between two universities in the United States and California, Stanford Research Institute and UCLA. And at the time, we were developing the internet as an ability for assured communications during a time of a nuclear disaster, assured communications for our military. It was never, ever thought with security and privacy in mind. It was never really thought about it that it would become the backbone of the global economy and every part of our daily life. It wasn't never considered for that. And if you go back into the archives, you'll see actual cartoons that, you know, the internet starts with a roller coaster, and it's the Batman symbol. It's going to save the world, and it goes into an equation of everything in the kitchen sink. And it was really, if you go to the architects of the internet, they could never have imagined of how it has come to fruition today. But the internet that we know from then, that started in '69, is not the internet that we're using today. The internet that we use today was really born in 1990 out of actually Switzerland and CERN with the World Wide Web. And that allowed us to click, connect, and search information all around the world. And our universities started to put information up on the net to allow us to actually develop that learning and that knowledge society. And so then, at the same time, we were seeing an explosion of technology that would allow it to go from this big old clunky desktop computer to a mobile computer to then a very mobile computer like this, right? A smartphone. How many people have a smartphone at least on them? How many have more than one smartphone with them? I'm sure some of the members of parliament do today. I have 3 with me today and have IP-connected devices. And as we had this explosion from 1990 to 2000, there was this demand for high-speed internet access, right? We have all these people who want to click, connect, and search information from now the palm of their hands, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that put a burden on our countries to create high-speed internet bandwidth to every last mile, right? Who wants to have a delay for the click, connect, and search information? Who wants to have a delay to get into their bank account? Who wants to have a delay in all of those things? And then if you were to, so that's in the 2000 to 2005 timeframe, and that gave birth to the true digital economy, right? We're starting to connect more and more things. Everybody in Europe does e-banking. Not everybody in the United States does e-banking yet. And we're doing all of these transactions on the internet, from whether it's looking at your health record, to looking at your bank account, to shopping online. And the internet has facilitated this backbone. Now if you start to fast forward, in the next 5 years, we're going to all move from having 3 to 5 of these internet-enabled devices associated with us to probably closer to 15 to 20. And that's what's called the Internet of Everything. In fact, you can't buy a product, an electronics product, pick your venue, without it having an internet-enabled technology. Your refrigerator will have an IP device. Your car will be an IP device, and any other real technology that you buy. And as you start to think about it, does my refrigerator really need to talk to the internet? Does my house, for its electricity, really need to talk to the internet? And I think that as countries and as companies, we need to start thinking about our future and how we're going to build that security and resilience in. And so if you start to think about, Albert Einstein once said, you can't solve our problems with the same thinking that we did when we created them. And so I think that we need to start thinking about different sets of solutions to the internet as we're going forward, because we have embedded information communications technology into everything. And it's with this promise of efficiency, right, and productivity of our companies. So we're modernizing our factories with controlled technologies to allow you to become more efficient. Our consumerism is we're seeing street shops closing because you can get the product faster and probably less expensive over and through the internet. Our buildings are becoming smart buildings that they control their energy and use different forms of energy. And everything from our financial systems to our transportation systems and our health systems. In fact, we're betting on this efficiency and productivity so much that the G20 countries are expecting this to lead to a minimum of 4% GDP growth. For every 10% or at 10% of our population that gets more connected to the internet, and a percentage of our companies that are using more and more internet-based technologies to increase that efficiency, it's going to lead to at least a percentage per each one of those of GDP growth. And for countries like China and Brazil and South Africa and India, who have an emerging internet population, they could see, and they're betting on the internet to have as much as a 10% GDP growth equation associated with it. So protecting this potential growth opportunity is becoming top of mind of global leaders, both political leaders and corporate leaders. The World Economic Forum, Davos, has listed both cybercrime as a key thing that they're worried about from intellectual property theft, but also cyber attack and the actual devastation or destruction of their core corporate assets. Country leaders like President Obama has talked about it as one of the greatest concerns for our economic and national security. Chancellor Merkel has talked about it as also a national security issue, but also with the overlay of privacy, and how we have to start to have a much better and stronger balance between security and privacy. And then President Putin has also talked about this, that this isn't necessarily for a multi-stakeholder or corporate decision, that this really has multilateral implications, and it should be countries deciding the future of the internet because of the economic and national security implications. And the problem here is that the infrastructure and internet entanglement has become a strategic vulnerability for all countries. Not just some countries, all countries. And in fact, the more internet enabled you are, and the more embedded that you've made it into your e-government and your e-banking and your e-health and your e-learning and the next generation power grids and the next generation air traffic control and every other critical service, citizen-facing services that our nations are responsible for providing are now vulnerable. And it's partly because we have produced and deployed and continue to use flawed systems, poorly engineered commercial systems that are the backbone that are operating the things that we care the most about and the most vital national systems. And nations can't afford to have that strategic vulnerability, which is why cybersecurity is becoming top of mind of all of the government leaders. It's why it's becoming part of all international negotiations. Because people are like, wow, I can't afford to lose that intellectual property. I can't afford to have the degradation of service. I can't afford for my corporate assets to be destroyed. And so I would say that we're running out of time. Me personally, were we winning or we losing? It's the balance in the trade spaces is we are winning because we have adopted all of these information communications technologies and we're modernizing our infrastructure, but oh my gosh, are we losing because we have this strategic vulnerability. And I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to use a construct and it's going to go 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I want to talk about what I see happening around the world. So first, number 6, there's an elephant in the room. There's an elephant in the room, and what does that mean? Well, somebody sees the tail, and they might call it cybercrime. Somebody else sees the trunk, and they said, nope, that's intellectual property theft. And another might say, wow, that's disruption of service, because they're seeing some part of the body. And the elephant in the room is nobody's seeing the whole elephant, and everybody's calling it cybersecurity. And so we're talking past each other. There's more than 100 countries that are cyber capable, whether that's offense, defense, exploitation, however you would like to define it. There's 100 countries. That's not a small handful. It's not the traditional World War II powers. It's not the traditional West. It's many countries. And there are non-state actors who are wielding state-like power that are influencing domestic and international politics, whether that's a group like a Hezbollah or Hamas, or that's a group like an Anonymous, who's actually now conducting lots of activity for the World Cup down in Brazil, or other non-state actors that are, causing us domestic and international challenges. The objectives vary, though, and I want to talk about 6 activities where I think that we're talking past each other. And the first is that some of our countries are talking about political activism. We, in the United States, have a very famous political activist. We have other names for him too, but I'm going to stick with political activist for now. And his name is Edward Snowden. And he brought a thumb drive, a $1.99 thumb drive, right, into a secure environment and compromised $1 trillion infrastructure at least to bring exposure to capabilities and activities that he disagreed with within the United States. He is a political activist. He used the internet effectively, very effectively. And he used smart technology or dumb technology to effectively move that information. But there are other people that are using technology like Twitter or Facebook to assemble in the streets of Cairo or Taksim Square or other countries to protest against their governments and, in fact, overthrow their governments. So that's also a form of political activism. So as we think about this, this is a multicultural problem. We don't all see it the same way. From which seat you sit is how you might see it. So one man's political activist might be another man's terrorist. And how our countries handle those political activists will be different all around the world. But we've wrapped that into the cybersecurity conversation. The second is organized crime. We have the Willie Sutton of the 21st century doesn't need to have a gun and a mask and walk into a bank. The Willie Sutton of the 21st century just needs a pretty good computer and can break into our banks and steal the real ones and zeros. Last year, and we're seeing this more and more, the ATM machines of many of our countries are being targeted, so you can get both a person's card and a person's PIN. You can replicate that, and then it gets widely distributed all around the world. When I was in the White House for President Obama, it was 30 cities in 30 minutes and $30 million. That's happening pretty periodically now. Last spring, it was $45 million in about 30 minutes in more than 40 cities. The criminals they're taking advantage of our vulnerabilities in our infrastructures. They're taking advantage of the fact that our lack of cooperation really in the law enforcement regime. And they're taking advantage of really it's easy money, right? It's the anonymity that's afforded by the internet to go steal and then launder and get money is quite significant. We're also seeing, and we had a very significant breach in the United States from a retail store called Target. Target's operations are effectively shutting down now here in Canada. Not necessarily as a result of this, but certainly I think it helps swiftly move it along. But we have 300 million citizens in the United States, and 100 million of them lost their credit cards just a few months ago. And the credit cards, they were stolen quite easily, again, from organized crime. You swipe your card in the point-of-sale terminal. Everybody does that every day, I think, right? You can do that downstairs at the Starbucks. You do it across the street. And you swipe the card, and it had a dual path transmission, one to your bank and one to organized crime. So I got the card and I got the PIN, and now I can go and I can go sell it. Well, your MasterCard is worth about $1 on the underground economy, and it'll easily get $1,000 for the organized crime for using it until the bank shuts it down. And your American Express card is worth about $5 because it's just higher value and usually higher end accounts. So organized crime, though, and how we're going to handle that as countries and through law enforcement activities is quite different, right, than political activism. The third area is intellectual property theft. It's what all of our countries are talking about. It's the stealing of our future economic opportunity and the illegally copying of the plans and capabilities and formulas and technologies of our key companies and moving it to other countries to facilitate the growth of industries and without having to pay for the research and development. In the United States, we're talking about this as the greatest transfer of wealth in our time. We're also talking about it as a cyber Pearl Harbor. And some of our leaders are talking about this as the greatest threat since or greater than terrorism. It's a pretty significant, but Chancellor Merkel and other prime ministers are talking about that this is a significant thing, and it's not just one country, it's many countries that are suffering from intellectual property theft. It's also sometimes, though, called espionage. And while, yes, it might be economic espionage, it's not helpful to call it espionage, because the fourth category is espionage, where we're using the internet and cyber activities to conduct espionage. All of our governments are doing it. To claim that any of our governments is not doing it, I think, is unjust, because it's the responsibility of our ministries of defense and of our intelligence services and whatever you name it to inform your leaders of the intentions and capabilities of others, mostly your adversaries. And no country is going to give that up. So to call intellectual property theft and bundle it with espionage and say, you can't do that while we're going to continue to do that is not responsible. And intellectual property theft, after all, could be handled in trade policy and through other things of countries that have signed up to the market system that we're all actually participating in. The fifth area is an area that we're not talking enough about, and it's the disruption of service. So as we have more and more of these capabilities these smart but really dumb devices that are highly infected or infectable quickly, reach the internet, we're going to start to see more and more degradation of service. In the United States, we're having a periodic disruption of our banks, where they're suffering from a distributed denial of service that is degrading our ability to conduct e-banking and other financial transactions. In other countries, we're seeing degradation of service also of their financial systems, but other critical services, for example, electricity and or delivery of energy. In the future, as we move to the internet of everything, and we have some exponential number of these infected dumb devices, we're going to see a lot more degradation of service. And our citizens are going to expect to have that service. The water flow in the morning to brush your teeth. The lights turn on and or turn off. They're going to expect to be able to use their smartphone to swipe the ticket so that they can go fly from Ottawa down to Washington Dulles. And they're going to expect these activities to be able to be there. And when they get degraded or they turn off, and I can assure you, I have been in an airport when the e-system has gone down, it will create chaos and cause challenges for all of our governments. The last area that I'm actually personally also worried about, because our countries aren't talking enough about it, is the destruction of property. The first use of a internet military-grade weapon that people have talked about is the use of Stuxnet against Iran's ability to create a nuclear weapon, to degrade their ability to make a nuclear weapon and slow that activity down. But the beauty of the click, connect, and search society is that everybody studied it and everybody published how and that weapon was used, what the vulnerabilities were that were used to exploit, and now we've seen multiple variants of that technology proliferate, a weapon that's proliferated. And it was used in August 2012, a variant of it, a dumb variant of it, against Saudi Aramco. And it's called the Shamoon virus. And Saudi Aramco, as you know, represents production of more than 10% of the world's oil, and some larger percentage of that of liquid natural gas. It was designed to hit their production system. It destroyed 70% of their IT assets. Think about that. For those of you, and if your government activity, if you lost 70% destroyed of all your computers, how effective are your operations going to be? And then for those of you who are corporate, it's a material risk. It's a real event. It was a life event. And it was the wake-up call for all of the boardrooms all around the world of how are we going to protect ourselves? How are we going to handle the cybersecurity of our corporate assets and our infrastructures? And current trends indicate that this is just going to get worse. The next 3 years are going to increase in the frequency and the gravity of all of these things because we're all going to continue to adopt this technology and embed it into our core infrastructures. So that was 6. 5. So we need to think about this as this is not just a United States or Canada or a single country or a regional problem. This is all of our problems. And we're talking about this in different ways. So we have 5 tensions in the system. So first, all of our countries have a digital agenda, a broadband initiative where we're all trying to get that connectivity to the very last mile for the hope of the GDP growth, for the hope of the efficiency and productivity. And in the same breath, we're saying we have a national security problem. And then all things flow down from there, right? We have this core vulnerability, a strategic vulnerability, and the backbone of all critical services that are delivering to our citizens. So the same tension then flows down. I have an infrastructure modernization agenda, right? I need these companies to come from the 20th century industrial side to the 21st century digital side. I need them to become more modern. I need them to become information users and such. And in the same breath, we're talking about, but we have to have critical infrastructure protection. We're not talking about how you can have modernization and security embedded in it. We're talking about go modernize, and then in a different part of our governments, we're talking about, but we need to have it protected. Then from there, the third area flows down is, well, who's responsible? Is it the private sector or is it the public sector? The public sector is responsible for provisioning, right, assuring citizen safety, the economic health and well-being, right, and all these citizen services. But you know what, at the end, and they're supposed to enable that through market mechanisms. Because at the end of the day, the private sector builds, designs, operates, will actually operate that infrastructure, will restore it in an event of a crisis, and really the private sector is in charge. So how does the government and the public sector facilitate the different market mechanisms to get to what we need for our nations, for the economy, and for national security? So part of the answer then is we start to say, well, we need better information sharing, a flow from the government to industry and industry back to government on what are some of the challenges. And then, but a different part of our governments are saying, but we have to have data protection too, right? So you need to share your information, but you need to protect the information. And in many times, actually, in most of our countries, in order to do one, you're breaking the other law, right? Think about that. In order to share the information, you're actually breaking the data protection law. That's the case in Europe right now. And if you have the data protection, then you're not following the law that says you have to share the information of how you got breached, what was the malware and stuff. And so we need to bring these conversations together across our governments and within our industry. And then finally, there's a tension about the political activism, this freedom of expression and democracy, that I have the right to be an activist. But at the same time, I need to ensure the political stability of my country. And those 5 tensions are part of how and why we're talking past each other against these 6 activities. There's so much tension in the system that we can't agree on what we're talking about and then what solutions that we need to follow. That was 5. So 4. As Aaron said, I had the opportunity to work for 2 very different presidents of the United States, and it was a great opportunity. And when I worked for President Bush, I was the last 2 years of President Bush, and I led the cybersecurity initiative, the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative for President Bush. And this was mostly for our government systems. And in that year, now I spent 20 some odd years in private consulting and working a lot with our government. But in that year, in 2008, I testified before our Congress 150 times, and I'm not exaggerating, across all of our different committees. I briefed and testified before Congress. It was more than almost any other government official. I think it was more than any government official, and many government officials combined. And what I found is that, you know, a lot of people will spend their time talking about the problem, but not enough people will spend their time rolling up their sleeves and solving the problem. And if you really want to solve the problem, you got to do 4 things. You first have to be authentic. You have to tell it like it is. You can't sugarcoat that we're losing a percentage of our GDP. You can't sugarcoat that a key corporation in your sovereign territory just lost 70% of its IT assets. You have to tell the problem, and you have to explain it in terms that people understand, and they have to take it seriously. And right now, we're not having necessarily a responsible conversation about what's really going on within our borders and outside of our borders. These 6 different activities that are taking place, not just a few activities that are taking place. And then you have to advocate. You know what? Right now, we do have still a flat economy, and the World Bank statistics that came out this morning that says that it's not very good, that we're all generally flat, that the economies are not recovering, and we may not really see that 4% GDP growth. So you know what? It's really going to be a trade. Is it economic security or is it national security? Or can it be both? Is it, do I really need these types of military capabilities, or do I really need to pull this resilience into the system? Do I really need to advance that smart grid? In the United States, we spent $8 billion on smart grid and 0 on the security of the smart grid. Was that responsible spending? Maybe if we did $2 billion on smart grids and $2 billion on security, we wouldn't be worried if the lights are going to really be on or off tomorrow. You have to be an ally. The government needs to ally with industry. They're not an adversarial relationship. After all, the industry really is, again, designing, going to build, going to operate this core infrastructure. They need to be a partner. And it's not the United States and others, it's everybody together, all of our countries with our private sector, and we're not thinking about it that way. I think it's an us and a them, and it's an east versus a west, and it's a north versus the global south, and we're all really in this whole fabric together. And then finally, mistakes will be made, And our leaders, both our government leaders and our corporate leaders, need to be held accountable. And we're not doing that. That's 4. So I'm told, and I have learned this over the course of a long time, is that you have to know your audience and you have to speak their language. Je parle un petit peu français, but I'm going to talk about 3 different ways to appeal, français, of 3 ways. You can appeal to the mind, you can appeal to the heart, or you can appeal to the wallet. And if you appeal to the mind, I'm a logic person. I try to always go for the logical argument. It doesn't work all the time. Okay, so we had an IP commission report that was commissioned by a bipartisan group of both former government leaders and key industry leaders that was produced about a year ago. And it talked about the amount of intellectual property theft that's happening in the United States. This is 2012. And they assessed that in real dollars lost and future dollars that they're worried about, as far as market share and other things, that they've lost in just 2012 alone, $300 billion. Just the United States, just intellectual property theft. That's greater than 1% of our GDP. That's comparable to all of our exports to Asia. Think about that. That's an enormous amount of money. We only have 300 million people, $300 billion. If you take 10% of that money and you were to reinvest that into a resilience campaign and a security campaign, you might be talking something. It's millions of jobs, and it's a significant GDP degradation. But that doesn't always translate to people. That's the logic argument. Now you got the heart argument. I'm a mom. I have a 13 and 14-year-old, and they challenge me every day on the internet, and they really do. But child identity theft and the collection that's happening against our children is significant. And in the United States, that there is a 100% increase year over year of the Social Security numbers, the national ID numbers for our children are being stolen. And why do people go after the kids? Well, because there's no background or credit check on children until they're applying for their first phone, or they're applying for university or college, or they're applying for their first job, or their house or something, right? Think about the different things. And so you can have, my kids got an identity card the day they were born. And so you can have 17, 16, 18 years of unfettered access to an identity that you can open up lines of credit, that you can buy houses and cars with. And the average 16-year-old that this has happened to, and there's many of them in the United States, are average $750,000 in debt by the time the parents discover it. That's significant. And so you're affecting their ability to win those student loans, to get that cell phone so they can talk to you, to secure a job in the workplace. We have actually had their futures stolen from them by criminals. Do we find that acceptable? And what are we doing to protect the children? And if that doesn't tug at you, you got to appeal to the wallet, right? So Saudi Aramco, I talked about that. The initial infection started with a $1.99 thumb drive, and it came in through the back office, and it swept through the whole infrastructure. And as I said, it was meant to hit the oil production. So could you imagine if you brought 10% of the world's oil supply offline for a week, a month? What would happen? What would be the price of petrol or liquid natural gas? Could we afford to actually go to work and drive our cars? Right? I remember the gas crisis in the early 1970s and the long lines and the unaffordable gasoline. I can imagine that it would be something more extreme than that in all of our countries. The average company is breached, and I would say every company has been breached. And the average company, it takes them more than 170 days to find the breach, to find that there's an infection on their system, that somebody's been stealing and illegally copying their intellectual property. When you have a breach like a Target did of losing all of our credit cards, it costs them $275 per card, right? 100 million people, that's a lot of money. That's not even talking about the capital costs that they have to replace part of that point of sale terminal swipe, or the lawsuits that they're having, or the market share of where people walked out of Target and are now at Walmart or some other store. The cost of an incident of an infection of poor employee clicked the wrong link, right? Clicked it and you get an infection. Costs a company $250,000 to clean that up. And if it's a more widespread infection, it could cost on average $1 million. An average company is hit, a big company or an average company, 3 times a week. So start to think about how that starts to add up in the bottom line of the balance sheet. That's significant. And if that doesn't grab your attention, if you're not a corporate leader, I'm going to use just a couple more statistics. I talked about the United States and the 1% of our GDP. I told the ambassador from the Netherlands, I always lead with the Dutch study. It was led by their TNO, which is a research arm and works quite closely with their industry. And they did an operations research study because they wanted to know how much of their economy was being hit by illicit and illegal activities like e-crime and intellectual property theft and identity theft and disruption of service. And what they found in 2010, the Holland grew by 1.6% GDP. All of those ICT, the digital agenda, paying off and creating that job opportunity and growth. In that same year, though, Holland lost 10 billion euro to e-crime, intellectual property theft, and identity theft. That was 2% of their GDP. So they could have grown by 3.6, or if you want to look at it the other way, they actually didn't have net growth at all because they had 1.6% growth and 2% loss. And that's a problem. We're promising our citizens that we're going to make it through these economic austere times by adopting and embedding this ICT into our core infrastructure. And Germany did a similar study, and it was led through the Industry Association of Germany. And in 2010, Germany had a really good year. She grew by 4.2% GDP. And in that same year, just to intellectual property theft, she lost 1.5% of her GDP. That's a lot. So if you could imagine that 4 of the G20 countries have all reported that they're losing a minimum of 1% of their GDP, can you imagine if all the G20 countries are losing at least 1% of their GDP? And what does that mean for the global economy? And embedding that information communication technology for the promise of productivity, efficiency, and the digital agenda. So leaders need to talk about what's at stake. For companies, it's about reputation and brand, price point, customer confidence, time to market, competitiveness. And for countries, it's about the quality of service that we've promised our citizens, the quality of protection that our citizens should demand. It's about lives and morale and battlefield communications, and there's stuff that we need to really do. I'm now down to 2. 2. We can choose to be a master or a victim of our history, and we need to control our destiny. So who's going to lead us through these conversations and have the tough conversations, the authentic conversations, be the advocate for what is needed for all of our countries and our businesses? Or are we going to continue to be victims and just complain about the problem and talk about the problem and allow our companies to be victims and our citizens to be victims? So that brings me down to 1. In 1 year, or 5 years, or 10 years, are we going to look back at this time as a time when normal market behavior and normal government actions failed to achieve our common goals? It doesn't have to be that way. Every one of us in this room can do something about it, and it has to start with each and every one of us in this room and us having a conversation with the next person and the next person to get a catalyst for action. And if it takes 150 times before your parliament or your Congress, so be it. Because there's only a few mechanisms for change, and I'm now in the conclusion, and the bar will be open in just a minute. It's been my experience, and there might be more, and this would be if I were in charge for a day. There's 5 mechanisms. You have policy, you have law, you can change the course and path of the technology, you can throw money at it, or you can also accept that there's external factors of influence that are shaping your actions that you need to, again, have a countervailing move to. So if we focus on the future right now, I'm going to just walk you through. In 2014, this year, we have an external influence that's happening in the internet governance and the multilateral versus multi-stakeholder versus multicultural. What's the future of the internet? And there's a series of negotiations that are happening, and one important negotiation is going to happen in South Korea in the fall in 2014. And it's going to be all these countries posturing for who's in charge and who's in control and how do we balance the power and monetization of the internet. Next year, we're going to enter into the Internet of Things, where each of us is going to have 5, maybe 8 of these devices associated with us. And so our vulnerability is going to go up at an exponential level. And I'm going to be selfish. In 2016, we have a US presidential election. And so things in the United States will be paralyzed because everything will be focused on who's the next president. You won't have action being taken because it'll all be running for who's going to win the White House. It doesn't matter if it's the Democrats or the Republicans. We're going to have a new president in 2016, starting on January 2017. And that president is going to inherit a lot of challenges because when that president takes office, they're going to be there for the Internet of Everything and this exponential vulnerability, strategic vulnerability to the core infrastructure. And so will all of your leaders as they take office and through your respective elections. So if I had the opportunity to change the conversation and use each of those 5 areas of what would I do, because I don't want to just talk about the problem. This is what I would do to solve the problem. And I've published on each one of these things, and they're available at Harvard. All you have to do is Google Harvard, Hathaway, and cyber, and you'll get to my webpage. The first is policy. I don't believe that our governments are necessarily serious about the cyber policies yet because we have not looked at the full gambit of market levers of both regulation and opt-in or market incentives to encourage adoption. And I can say that from an authoritative source from the United States. And what I would see is that in the United States, I think that the cyber policy needs to model the energy policy. We have and want to diversify our oil consumption and diversify our energy capabilities. And as such, we have a citizen opt-in strategy tax credit where our citizens will get a tax credit for modernizing their windows, fuel-efficient windows, for putting solar panels in their backyard or on their roofs, for driving electric cars. And we've incentivized our citizens to adopt into this policy of energy diversification. Some of them may not know that that's what they're doing. They just know that they're getting a tax credit. They have to pay less to the government, right? That's okay. We do the same for our businesses, and we give them the same types of tax advantages for a solar or wind alternative energy to fuel their enterprises, for modernizing their infrastructures. But we also, more importantly, give them a 17% R&D tax credit, research and development tax credit, to invest in the next generation technologies that will get us off of oil. That's important, right? So you've got them to opt into this strategy. I think we need something similar for cybersecurity. I think that we need to create the market environment so that citizens will adopt in or opt in to having better security for their homes and infrastructures, for the businesses, a 17% R&D tax credit. So I think that we need to model that policy in the United States, and there may be other examples. The second, we need to update the law. And in the United States, we have a very old, arcane way of looking at telecommunications. And the internet somehow doesn't fall as a telecommunications device. I don't know about you, but when you use Skype or you use FaceTime, I'm pretty sure that that's like a phone call. And so I think that our internet service providers need to be treated like telecommunications providers and regulated with the same standard of care. Some think that that would stifle innovation. But I think it's becoming a necessary thing because as proven here in Canada by Bell Canada, you can actually prevent some of these infections from reaching their target and alert customers when they're infected so that they're not getting reduced quality of bandwidth. And that we can ask much more of our internet service providers. Alert us when there's a botnet on our infrastructure. right? And many countries in Europe and Australia and Japan and other places are in fact doing this. And so I think that this could be a standard of care, or something that all of our countries could adopt into. After all, telecommunications is generally a regulated market in all of our countries. Could we more broadly define it and have this be a opportunity or a mechanism to introduce health and hygiene and eliminate the infections or the pollution on our infrastructures? The third is to addressing technology. As I said earlier, I can't imagine all of us with opting in of having this thing that got to market quickly with full functionality and also full ability to get infected, having this part of our core infrastructures, right? They're not well-engineered products, but instead we will have embedded them. Would we drive a car that didn't have the anti-lock brakes or the seat belt or the airbag or the OnStar communication or the IP node to alert that if you've had an accident? No. Our governments won't allow cars that don't meet certain standards to be sold in our markets or to be ridden on our roads, right? We don't allow faulty nuclear power plants to be operating. We demand things to be well engineered. So how is it that we're allowing this core of the commerce to enter into our critical infrastructures without having the same engineering standards and principles that we've had for all of our other areas? Can we start to do that and demand and prepare for the Internet of Everything and field systems? Demand that the ICT market deliver well-engineered products with few to no vulnerabilities? I don't think that that's unreasonable. The fourth area is money. So in many of our countries, there's only a finite window of when you can advocate for money, and also in our companies, to advocate for the investments. And they go on these cycles. And so right now, the United States is preparing the FY17 budget. So we're in the process of preparing the budget that the next president is going to inherit. Think about that, 2 years from now. So it's incumbent upon the people who are currently serving that they need to prepare and ensure that there's capabilities for the next person who's serving. And it's kind of hard to get your head wrapped around that you're doing that planning for 2 years from now, and that's the budget that they're going to inherit. You can think about the same way for our corporations, for other governments. Is this cycle it's usually every other year, and how are you going to ensure that you have things in place? And then finally, the international debate on whether this is a multilateral conversation, a multi-stakeholder conversation, or a multicultural conversation. And talking past each other in those 6 different activities is becoming a problem. Because we're talking about things of data localization, we're talking about things that really will affect our overall economic interoperability and the marketplace, and the overall provisioning of 24/7 services. So we need to start thinking about how are we going to all go to the negotiation table with a common understanding that this is this thing, the internet, that we started in 1969, that what we know it was born in 1990, but that all of us are completely digitally dependent upon, that we all are going to continue to be completely digital dependent upon, how we're going to work together to ensure that it maintains its resiliency and can continue to fuel our economies and our competitiveness and the business and innovation opportunity. And that's something that we're not talking about enough, of that common understanding of that fabric that we're all dependent upon. And the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil or bad things is for everybody, or the good men, to do nothing and just watch the problem unfold. And I spend every day of my life trying to influence or get one person in this room or in a conversation to understand what's at stake and to roll up their sleeves and do something about it. And I really thank you for the opportunity to be here, to be back in Ottawa, to be in this prestigious club. And I welcome your questions. Thank you.
I found your remarks to be insightful, well-spoken, and provocative. This has been a tremendous experience to hear you speak again, and it was just, it was eye-opening. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Melissa Hathaway.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Larry Lederman, the MC for this event, the sixth session sponsored by the Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI, located in Waterloo, Ontario. First, I would like to recognize some of our guests. The recently arrived, just a month ago, Ambassador of Afghanistan, His Excellency Sham Bathija, the High Commissioner of Malaysia, Her Excellency Dato, she's at the back, she's shy, Hayat Ismail, thank you. The Ambassador of the Netherlands, Kees Kolle. The Ambassador of Switzerland, His Excellency Ulrich Lehner. And members of several embassies, Japan, Spain, Germany, France, the United States, the UAE, Chile, Israel, and if I've left anyone out, please let me know and I'll identify you. We also welcome members of Parliament and departments and agencies of the Canadian government and members of Carleton University and Ottawa University, and also former Canadian ambassadors who are arriving late, but that's all right. And so now it is my pleasure to ask Aaron Scholl to please come to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you very much, Larry, and it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here to welcome Melissa Hathaway to the podium.
I want to talk about first is the internet. The internet began on October 29th, 1969, with a transmission between two universities in the United States and California, Stanford Research Institute and UCLA. And at the time, we were developing the internet as an ability for assured communications during a time of a nuclear disaster, assured communications for our military. It was never, ever thought with security and privacy in mind. It was never really thought about it that it would become the backbone of the global economy and every part of our daily life. It wasn't never considered for that. And if you go back into the archives, you'll see actual cartoons that, you know, the internet starts with a roller coaster and it's the Batman symbol. It's going to save the world, and it goes into an equation of everything in the kitchen sink. And it was really, if you go to the architects of the internet, they could never have imagined of how it has come to fruition today. But the internet that we know from then, that started in '69, is not the internet that we're using today. The internet that we use today was really born in 1990 out of actually Switzerland and CERN with the World Wide Web. And that allowed us to click, connect, and search information all around the world. And our universities started to put information up on the net to allow us to actually develop that learning and that knowledge society. And so then, at the same time, we were seeing an explosion of technology that would allow it to go from this big old clunky desktop computer to a mobile computer.
My name is Aaron Scholl. I'm legal counsel to the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo. I'm delighted to welcome Melissa for two reasons. The first is that she's recently joined CIGI as a distinguished fellow, and I've had the opportunity to work with her on various matters, and I can indicate without reservation that she's deeply impressive, both in terms of her substance and her ability to convey complex material succinctly. It's truly an honor to be able to welcome her for that reason. The second reason is the breadth of experience that Melissa brings. She was a senior advisor to two presidents. She runs her own consulting firm. She ran the cyberspace policy review for the United States government. I mean, her background is absolutely exceptional in this ongoing and riveting area of policy making and policy concern. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Melissa Hathaway.
Thank you. Good evening. It's truly my pleasure to be here this evening. Support CIGI and the Global Policy Forum, Larry for the welcome here to the Rideau Club, and for actually the honor of all of you showing up and taking your time to listen to me tonight. I hope that I earn my glass of wine at the end of this, and that you enjoy what I have to say, or are not too scared when you leave the room. And so I plan on speaking for about 40 minutes, and I know it's advertised for maybe 30. It depends on how fast I end up speaking. And the title of my presentation is Cybersecurity, Are You Winning or Are You Losing? And I'd like to give you kind of a tour de table of how to think about cybersecurity. And I'm going to start with just a brief introduction. Device and any other real technology that you buy. And as you start to think about it, does my refrigerator really need to talk to the internet? Does my house, for its electricity, really need to talk to the internet? And I think that as countries and as companies, we need to start thinking about our future and how we're going to build that security and resilience in. And so if you start to think about, Albert Einstein once said, you can't solve our problems with the same thinking that we did when we created them. And so I think that we need to start thinking about different sets of solutions to the internet as we're going forward, because we have embedded information communications technology into everything. And it's with this promise of efficiency, right, and productivity of our companies. So we're modernizing our factories with controlled technologies to allow you to become more efficient. Our consumerism, as we're seeing street shops closing because you can get the product faster and probably less expensive over and through the internet. Our buildings are becoming smart buildings that they control their energy and use different forms of energy. And everything from our financial systems to our transportation systems and our health systems. In fact, we're betting on this efficiency and productivity so much that the G20 countries are expecting this to lead to a minimum of 4% GDP growth. For every 10% or at 10% of our population that gets more connected to the internet, and a percentage of our companies that are using more and more internet-based technologies to increase that efficiency, it's going to lead to at least a percentage per each one of those of GDP growth. And for countries like China and Brazil, to then a very mobile computer like this, right, a smartphone. How many people have a smartphone at least on them? How many have more than one smartphone with them? I'm sure some of the members of parliament do today. I have 3 with me today, and of IP-connected devices. And as we had this explosion from 1990 to 2000, there was this demand for high-speed internet access. Right? We have all these people who want to click, connect, and search information from now the palm of their hands, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that put a burden on our countries to create high-speed internet bandwidth to every last mile. Right? Who wants to have a delay for the click, connect, and search information? Who wants to have a delay to get into their bank account? Who wants to have a delay in all of those things? And so, and then if you were to, so that's in the 2000 to 2005 timeframe, and that gave birth to the true digital economy, right? We're starting to connect more and more things. Everybody in Europe does e-banking. Not everybody in the United States does e-banking yet. And we're doing all of these transactions on the internet, from whether it's looking at your health record, to looking at your bank account, to shopping online. And the internet has facilitated this backbone. Now if you start to fast forward, in the next 5 years, we're going to all move from having 3 to 5 of these internet-enabled devices associated with us to probably closer to 15 to 20. And that's what's called the Internet of Everything. In fact, you can't buy a product, an electronics product, out of, pick your venue, without it having an internet-enabled technology. Your refrigerator will have an IP device. Your car will be an IP